Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephen Gale. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the Afro-Amerindian Research and Cultural Center in Metro Atlanta, Georgia. And I would like to welcome you to our third event for the Dividing Lines Symposium. This is our third annual symposium. And of course, this year, as many other things, it is virtual. And we are glad to have Rachael Finch here today to present on the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall. Rachael Finch is the Senior Director of Preservation and Education for the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County. With 10 years of experience in historic preservation, museum leadership, and nonprofit management, Ms. Finch leads the preservation and education team in all preservation projects and interpretation planning, educational programming, and advocacy. Ms. Finch holds a MA in public history and emphasis in the historic preservation, cultural resource management, and administration of historical organizations from Middle Tennessee State University, and a BA in history and political science from the Metropolitan State University in Denver, Colorado. From 2015 to 2020, Finch served as the executive director for the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation. Previous to her time with the foundation, Ms. Finch has served as a research historian for the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area, authoring over 150 Civil War trail markers in collaborative partnership with Tennessee Department of Tourism, the Tennessee Department of Transportation, and Tennessee State Parks. She also served as the Civil War Projects Coordinator for the Center of Historic Preservation at Middle Tennessee State University. Finch, a recipient of the Scott Hartwig Fellowship in the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, serves on the board of directors for the Franklin Civil War Roundtable, is the chair of the City of Franklin Civil War Historical Commission, and the board of directors for the Tennessee Preservation Trust. She has appeared in several award-winning documentaries, including The American South as We Know It and Desperate Days, The Last Hope for the Confederacy. Finch has presented on architecture and the cultural landscape, slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, the ethics of public history and preservation, inclusivity and museum scholarship, and collaborative partnerships at conferences across the country, including the University of Virginia President's Commission on Slavery, the Lemon Project at the College of William and Mary, and the National Council for Public History, the American Association of State and Local History, and the Slave Dwelling Project, as well as the Southern Historical Association. Finch is a native of New Orleans, lives in Spring Hill, Tennessee with her husband, Eric, and grown children. Thank you so very much, Rachael, for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, Stephen. I'm really excited about this.
So we talked like over the course of the better part of a year and a half or so about this site. And so, you know, it has like a wide kind of varied history. So for those who aren't familiar, could you possibly just give us like a brief overview of what is the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The Historic Franklin Masonic Hall is nearing 200 years old. And it has a very complex past tied to not only the community of Franklin, but also the state of Tennessee and the United States. It's recognized as a National Historic Landmark by the Department of the Interior for its ties to the Treaty of Franklin, signed between members of the U.S. government and the Chickasaw Nation. And it actually has another significance from a Masonic standpoint because it still houses the oldest occupying Masonic lodge, the fraternity itself, in the state of Tennessee, known as Hiram Lodge number 7, and they date back to the year 1809. So Franklin became a town in 1799. So that kind of gives you an idea as to how old the fraternity is itself, and the generations of men who have been attached to this building and this place. And then also the age of the building itself, 1799 for the creation of Franklin, to 1823 when it was first being constructed. That's not even, 25 years, and you're seeing early Gothic revival architecture coming to life, really in what was still considered the old, Northwest Territory. This is still foreign land. so to speak. It's still rugged, it's still pioneer, but you're seeing the expansion of architecture, culture, and society coming into Tennessee, and this building stands as a reminder of all of that.
So, I know you have a presentation. I don't want to step on it too much,
No, no.
but it also apparently has a significant history as far as Native history, um, if I'm not mistaken. So, like, if you could possibly
Hmm.
discuss some of that, and also the intersection there with African American history in the local area.
Sure. Well, this is the site of the signing of the Treaty of Franklin, 1830. It took place August 31st of 1830 between the United States government and about 22 Chickasaw leaders representing the Chickasaw Nation, including George and Levi Colbert. And this really was the launching point for what we know as the Trail of Tears. There had been several treaties signed, obviously going back into the late 1700s, even as early as 1804, when we're looking at Chickasaw starting to cede their land to the United States. But this was really a pivotal moment because this is where the Chickasaws were able to really have a point of negotiation with the United States government, choosing where they would be able to move to. If they're ceding their land, then they wanted to have first right of refusal of land that they could find comparable to what they had east of the Mississippi River, west of the Mississippi River. And that is what makes this treaty so important, is that they were able to negotiate for that one particular thing. And I also think it's important to note that, and I'll talk a little bit more about this during the presentation too, but that, you know, Andrew Jackson was here in Franklin negotiating with them, but he was not signing a treaty with them. There were other individuals representing the US government that were a part of all of that negotiation. Jackson was in Franklin for about 36 hours, maybe 48 hours total. And he actually spoke to the Chickasaw leaders prior to coming to the Masonic Hall to speak with them. And so you can kind of see how there's different places in Franklin that were being occupied by the government as well as the representation of the Chickasaw Nation. And what makes that so important and so impactful is that those places no longer stand today. They're also not denoted for their ties to the Treaty of Franklin of 1830. And most people, when you mention the Trail of Tears or you mention American Indian removal, they immediately jump to, oh, we're talking about Chickasaws. No, we're not. We're talking about, Chickasaws. We're talking about Cherokee. And I think the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee removal was so impactful as the last, pivotal nation to be removed from their land, in 1837 to 1838, that most people have no idea of the comprehensive removal plan that was put in place by the United States government that involved the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Creeks, the Seminoles, and how the Seminoles would fight the US government, and then also with the Cherokee. So I think it's really important that when we're looking at culturally significant places, that we look to a place like the Masonic Hall to really kind of peel back the layers of onion, as it were, to explore how a significant place can have such impactful history. And really, this building stands as a witness site and a testimony to the Chickasaw Nation negotiating for power over where they would be able to move to. And then the unfortunate reality that the longer that the treaty was drawn out, the longer it was rendered null and void. And then, of course, they were faced with removal. And then, of course, the impacts of what that meant. But it also means that there's a part of the history that's left out of even that negotiation piece, which is, the US government allowed for the Chickasaws and the other 5 civilized tribes to take their enslaved with them. And that story is not explored enough. And I know that from speaking with members of some of the tribes today, that there's still some contention as to how they want to talk about having enslaved individuals, enslaved African Americans as part of the removal. And I think they're just now starting to really discuss that in a more open and inclusive manner, even though there have been plenty of historians and genealogists doing the work for a long time on that subject. I think it's important to realize that there is some, that there's just difficulty surrounding American Indians being removed, but then we're also moving another group of individuals who did not have choice, and that were their enslaved population. And what did that mean, and how did that impact the enslaved African Americans who were part of, plantation culture with the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, the Creeks, Seminoles, and Cherokee, and that's important as well. And we want to kind of bring that story to light, because I think it's important for us to understand what that means when we're looking at under the guise of citizenship, voting rights, being able to own property, access to education, access to public health. All of these things stemming from the 19th century is still being played out today. So how can historic sites really be that beacon, that foundation to be able to help from a public history component, bring those stories to light authentically and transparently, and allow that information to be shared in an appropriate way based on scholarship and research.
And before I go too far on the deep end in terms of questions, I definitely want to give you some time to go through your presentation, and then afterwards, whatever questions weren't addressed, I can pose them then. And if any people watching or people on social media, wherever, as we get questions, we'll field those as well.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So are we ready?
Yep.
Okay. So this is the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall as we see it today. The building was built in 1823 and it was completed by 1826. Even today, it's still the oldest three-story public building standing in Franklin. And it, like I said earlier, it's still occupied by Hiram Lodge number 7, and they are the oldest continually occupying fraternity in the state of Tennessee. So tremendous history tied to this particular site. And it's a very commanding building. The Masonic Hall is important for several things. As I said, it's the only pre-1830 Gothic Revival building in Tennessee. And it's still the oldest Masonic Hall in its original location, still standing in Tennessee. So there's very important, iconic moments in time where architecture and place matter. And when we're looking at architecture in Tennessee, to have a pre-1830 Gothic Revival structure still standing is just rare. It's one of 30 National Historic Landmarks recognized by the Department of Interior that stands in Tennessee. And it has significant history tied to Franklin, as I said, and also the state and the United States. The first floor was built as a community space. The second and third floor were always reserved for the Masons. So the community had access to this building from the very beginning. But I think it's very important to understand that when we look at a building of this magnitude, that when we talk about its architecture, its beauty, its strength through its construction, that we really must look at who actually built the building. And it was commissioned by the Masons, but it was constructed with the use of enslaved laborers, whose fingerprints are still seen in the bricks today. And interestingly enough, James Hervey Odie, who's the gentleman in the top image, he is not only the first Episcopal bishop here in Tennessee who founded the first Episcopal church on the first floor of the Masonic Hall, but he's also a slaveholder. He has very strong ties throughout the South within the Episcopal Church. He will be the one who is the founder of the University of the South. And fortunately today, the university is taking the appropriate steps to actually unravel its ties to slavery. And I think that's excellent, as we're seeing with a lot of universities across the country doing that important work. But it also has significant religious history. You know, it was a meeting site during the Second Great Awakening. The Mormons met there, if you can believe that. Tolbert Fanning, who was a very influential evangelical minister, actually preached there in the Masonic Hall. So there's all of these significant events with important people that are recognizable figures within either local or state history and national history that spend time in this building. But so many people to this day don't realize that, because the building has been closed off up until about 5-6 years ago from the public. And again, antebellum life. I always tell people when they've come on tours in the past couple of years that if you wanted to understand how Tennessee transformed from a Western state to a Southern powerhouse state, really look to Middle Tennessee, Davidson County, Williamson County, which is, of course, where Franklin and this Masonic Hall sit today, Murray County. This is where the influential people are coming from within the state legislature. And that's also where the money is. Williamson County is what was the third largest slaveholding county on the eve of the Civil War in 1860. And it was one of the top 5 wealthiest counties in the state of Tennessee prior to the Civil War. And even to this day, Williamson County is the wealthiest county in the state of Tennessee. And it's in the top 25 of wealthiest counties in the United States today. So a lot of things have not changed when we're looking at the progression of wealth and prominence. And even politically today, a lot of our state legislatures come from Williamson County that sit on very influential committees. And then obviously we have 2 state senators that are pretty influential, as well as our US House representatives from this county that sit at the US Capitol. So it's pretty remarkable that the political history still remains. But I think when we're looking at the political influence, we need to look at who were the movers and shakers, specifically in the early to mid 1800s. And we have Davy Crockett, we have Andrew Jackson, we have John Bell, who he'll be running on the constitutionalist ticket against against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Sam Houston, Felix Grundy. These are men who are Masons of this lodge. They may not all live in Williamson County, but they spend significant time in Williamson County, and they're all Masons. I think we think of Masons today as people who are like cloistered in a little room and they wear funny costumes. But in the 19th century, to be a Mason meant you were a man of influence and, society and political prominence, and you were well educated. And this was part of, coming out of the Enlightenment period, and obviously this creation of our nation. And we see a lot of well-known, recognizable national figures who have ties to Tennessee that are actually a part of this Masonic Lodge here in Franklin. And so I think when we're thinking about why was Franklin so significant, particularly when we think about the politics as we move to the Civil War, ties to slavery and the slave trade. Many of these men had ties, obviously, to slavery and the slave trade. Some of them were slave traders themselves who were Masons locally. And obviously we know that Jackson, James K. Polk, who was also a Mason, and even Andrew Johnson, he was also a Mason too. But they're all slaveholders. They all have ties to this powerful machine that they really understood, and how to motivate politically the reasons to keep it. And then obviously when they're looking at how are we going to expand the country, I think Jackson, particularly once he becomes president in 1828, he's going to start this quick progression of moving towards the American Indian Removal Act. And that's what we see by May of 1830. And John Bell is going to be one of the authors of that act. And he's from Tennessee. He was born in Franklin. He's an attorney. He's a Mason. He's very familiar with Franklin. And I think it's just so important to understand how the players here in politically, that are from Tennessee, that are sitting in Washington, have such, control and the ability to manipulate the situation for their gain. And I think that's really important to look at, and how they were strategically motivated by land, by slavery, and by power. And then that's going to propel us towards the Civil War. So, our story at the Masonic Hall begins with this building, because there is power in place. As a preservationist, as a public historian, I firmly believe that there is no better way to tell a story than by being able to go to the place where an event actually occurred. Even if the place isn't standing anymore, there's still power within the place that you are at. And I think looking at these images, we see the Beaded Cat by George Colbert, the enslaved children's fingerprints and the bricks, as well as adult fingerprints. It's like there's no choice, and how is one expressing power? Again, Civil War graffiti even on the walls still remain at the Masonic Hall today. Never knowing, when you're not the one in a position of power, what the next move is going to be by those in power, I think is rather telling. And that's the way that we've been telling the story at the Masonic Hall, is that this is about what it meant to be American. This is what it meant to be one in power, one with choice, one with equality. And then what about the marginalized voices? What about the voices we've never heard? We're not a historic house museum. So how do we start telling these stories with compassion, with authenticity, and what it really means to show the humanity within the inhumanity of what transpired and what we still see today? Because it's not as if, well, the Native Americans were removed, or African Americans were enslaved and then they were freed after the war and then everything was fine. That is so not the case, and we all know that. And we're seeing those legacies still play out today. And it's imperative as historians, public historians and preservationists, to encourage these difficult conversations, but yet mindful, needful conversations, to understand where we were and where we are today, and how so much of that is still being played out in the political arena, in our communities. And I think that that's really where historic sites such as the Hall have an ability to really speak truth to power. And when we're looking at the negotiations for the Treaty of Franklin in 1830, you'll see the map below is really showing you what today is considered northern Mississippi. It was Chickasaw and Choctaw land. That's really what the US government was looking for. There was a little piece left in Alabama and a tiny little piece towards the top of the border area between Tennessee and Mississippi. But really, by this point in 1830, the Tennessee Chickasaw land had been ceded to the US government. And this is what Jackson's administration was after. Obviously, we know who Jackson is. We don't really have to go into a lot with him. But I think it's important to at least note the other two gentlemen, General John Coffee, who was an Indian commissioner, and who was part of Jackson's administration, as well as John Eaton. He was Jackson's Secretary of War. And he actually lived next door to the Masonic Hall. His house does not stand today, but he was a Franklinite. He was also a Mason. And it's so interesting to start kind of studying the history of Franklin and of these individuals, because the focus was always on, oh, the Chickasaws came and they were in town for 2 weeks and they slept in tents, or they slept in their teepees, quote unquote. And Peggy Eaton, John's wife, came and moved her organ out onto the front porch and played to entertain the Chickasaws. And that's just not true. But it's interesting that that's been the progression of the story that's been told, that this was something that was good. This was something that was beneficial. for the United States as well as for the Chickasaws. And I think depending on who you ask, one is going to say, yes, this was beneficial. And the other group is probably going to tell you, no, it was not. The Chickasaws may have believed at the time that this was a bargaining chip. This was a good negotiation, that they were going to have the power of choice to choose where they could move to. But I also think that we can't just assume that the Chickasaws thought that this was a great idea. I think they realized that, you know, we have to protect what is ours. We have to understand that this forced settlement, you know, it is something that we are going to have to claim, and how we're going to have to deal with it. And that's where things get very interesting in Franklin. Andrew Jackson will come and he will kind of orate really at the Chickasaw leaders inside of the Presbyterian Church in downtown Franklin. That church building doesn't stand today, but he stands up there and he says, you know, I, your white father, look at my red children and I take you by the hand. I mean, how much more of a racist statement can you make? Not to mention condescending. To know that these men fought with Jackson during the War of 1812. They looked at him as a warrior. They had respect for him. And obviously within their own rights, you know, George and Levi Colbert were plantation owners. They owned slaves. You know, they had kind of strategically modeled some of their life after, you know, white elites in the South. They're plantation owners. And so giving up a lot of this land that is so ripe for cultivation, and how and their financial well-being is something that they wanted to ensure that they could be able to recoup once they had the ability to choose another place to live. And I think that, you know, by the time 1830 rolls around, the US government is wanting to codify their official policy on removing all Native Americans from territories east of the Mississippi River. But that same year, you know, the Chickasaws and the Choctaws signed the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek with the United States, which resulted in the loss of all of the Chickasaw land in Mississippi. So the Choctaws were actually invited to this negotiation table here in Franklin, and they refused. So I think it's important to kind of note that, you know, this was not just supposed to be between the Chickasaws and the US government. The Choctaws were also supposed to be here, and that they just did not want to come to the negotiating table. They thought that it was a slap in the face after what had happened to them, and they just chose to not come to Franklin. So by 1830, the Chickasaws become the last remaining sovereign nation in Mississippi to still have land. And of course, they're going to quickly lose that. And of course, between 1830 and 1833, most of the Choctaws were forced to resettle in Indian Territory, which of course we know today as modern day Oklahoma. And over 2,500 of the Choctaw will die alone on the Trail of Tears. And again, that's just something that's not really talked about. I think when we can probably all agree that when we were in school, we learned about the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears and the results of that. And it was usually a blip in our history classes. And I think we've done a disservice to history education by not really talking about the realities, the difficulties of what American history is about. And again, that's where we as a historic site or as a historic organization, preservation organization, have an opportunity to, you know, change the narrative, come to the table and say, we need to collaborate with other groups to start telling this story. Because these are the stories that matter. This is the pivotal moment in time where you see marginalized voices being silenced. They're not expanded upon in the history books. They're not being given any moment of equity. And it's all about white men. And our goal over the past several years has been to say, we're not going to really focus on Jackson. Jackson was there. Yes, Jackson orated at them again at the Presbyterian Church. But let's not just focus on Jackson. Let's focus on how the Chickasaw leaders approached Jackson. What was their position with Andrew Jackson, John Coffey, John Eaton? And what we have been finding out through the research is that they were very adamant that they did not appreciate Jackson's approach in methodology in speaking to them. And they decided that if they were going to have any bargaining chip and negotiation power, that they would have to come to the table in a very neutral setting. To negotiate in a church, to be spoken to that way in a church, that's not how the Chickasaw leaders saw themselves. And several of these Chickasaw leaders were also Masons. To be a Mason just means you have to believe in a supreme being and bettering oneself. You do not have to be anything other than that. And so there were Native American men who were Masons, and the Colberts were Masons. So they're looking to places within Franklin to where could they meet. They knew they didn't want to meet outside. They knew they didn't want to meet in a courthouse. That's too political. Where can we meet? And that place became the Masonic Hall. And that first floor, that community space, is where all of this negotiation took place. So by August of 1830, the Chickasaw leaders and the U.S. nation are negotiating and signing the treaty that would result in the selling of all of their remaining land and then resettling in Indian territory. And Jackson, as I said, was there for just 48 hours. He was not there long. It was really Secretary of War John Eaton and Indian Commissioner John Coffey and several other members of Jackson's administration that stayed and negotiated over a period of almost 2 weeks. So this is an image of what the first floor of the Masonic Hall looks like today. The brick walls are original to the 1823 construction. Obviously, those beautiful hotel chairs from like the Quality Inn at in the 1980s were not part of the original setup there. But this is the place. This is the very space in which you have men like Andrew Jackson, but men like George and Levi Colbert and other members of the Chickasaw Nation standing in this very room, sitting in this very room, deciding the fate of their nation. And even when I talk about it, I still get chills, because when you stand in that space, it's not anything glamorous. You know, it's brick walls and, you know, an ash floor. And that very back wall was added in the 1980s. So that's just sheetrock, but there's still something to be said for being in that space. The fact that the building is still standing is astounding. But I think what's remarkably telling is that this place doesn't have a place of prominence within American history when we're talking about American Indian removal. And we want to be able to change that narrative. We want to be able to save this place and be able to tell these stories, because to know that it's a National Historic Landmark, not because of Civil War graffiti and not because Andrew Jackson or James K. Polk, you know, spent time there as Masons, but because of this Treaty of Franklin of 1830, the process of Indian removal beginning here. That's what makes this place a National Historic Landmark. And in the 1970s, when, you know, they're looking at places to put on the National Register of Historic Places and create the National Historic Landmark status, this is a place that was chosen, which I think is just remarkable. It's important to note that the Masons did not want that designation because they thought that that was going to cause issues for them as being able to do with what they wanted to do with the building. And That, of course, is true. But it didn't stop the process of becoming a National Historic Landmark, which I think is very valuable today, because I think that the building would face architectural changes, and that could actually have hurt the structure if it wasn't a National Historic Landmark. So because I'm very glad and grateful for those that stuck to their guns and made sure that this was recognized as an NHL. Because now to restore it, we have to follow, obviously very strict criteria to ensure that the historicity and the fragility of the building are addressed, but yet it retains all of its original features, or as much as possible, when it is preserved. So, and when you're dealing with such a powerful moment in time, I think that this is a place that should always be elevated, not because the Masons still meet there, not because of anything else, but because of the difficult history, the realities tied to, a larger minority voice deciding the fate of, the majority of people who didn't have a choice. It's Machiavellian at its best. And that's what makes this place so powerful, and of course, a lot of us do know, based on the realities of the Treaty of Franklin being rendered null and void, that the Chickasaws were removed to what is now, modern day eastern Oklahoma. And this void opened up the Deep South for white settlement and the expansion of slavery. That would really propel us into the Civil War. And I think that it's just a telling fate to see where these moments in time really transcend history. And that's, again, why this place matters. So as we fast forward to the Civil War, Franklin, Williamson County is going to send many regiments of Confederate men off to the battlefields. But by 1862, citizens in Franklin and Williamson County are going to see people that they've never seen before in uniform. And that's going to be federal troops in blue. And then by the summer of 1863, they're also going to see African Americans in blue as members and soldiers in the United States Colored Troops. And they're going to occupy Franklin. They're going to occupy Fort Granger, which is about half a mile away on a bluff from the Masonic Hall. And African Americans will not fight in the Battle of Franklin, which is what Franklin is most known for, which took place November 30th of 1864. But they will be playing a vital role in, obviously, the Battle of Nashville, which is December 15th and 16th of 1864, and in the removal of the Confederate Army out of Tennessee, which will take place from December 17th all the way to the end of that month of 1864. And in Williamson County, over 330 African American men, formerly enslaved men who just sought their own freedom, fled to federal lines and joined the USCT. And this summer, I think on Juneteenth, they're actually going to be installing a bronzed monument of a United States Colored Troop that will actually represent the USCT from Williamson County. And it's going to actually stand in front of the courthouse on the public square in Franklin. And it's going to face the Confederate monument that still stands in the public square. And that's a whole other sordid story, maybe for another panel. But there are things changing in Williamson County. There are things changing in Tennessee. And I'm really proud to say that, we played just a very small role in pushing the needle forward on that. But to finally see representation of the African-American experience during the war is really telling, because I didn't ever think that I would see that. We can't take down monuments in Tennessee because of our Tennessee Heritage Protection Act, but it doesn't stop us from putting up new ones either. So this is something that was done, you know, grassroots. It was with African-American and white pastors and historians and city government and county government support. And there's a large contingency of the community that are supporting this effort as well. And I think that that's very telling, and it's part of our Civil War identity, right? It's how we only told one side of the story with a Confederate monument, that this is all that mattered again. But yet, no, there's more to the story. There is a whole story. Let's tell the whole story. And I think obviously by putting that monument to the USET in the public square, that we're actually going to be telling that fuller story, as it's called in Franklin. But I think going back to the Masonic Hall, how do we tell that fuller story of occupation? The graffiti on the walls hold numerous stories and many secrets. As you can see here, these particular graffiti marks are very visible on the second floor wall of the Masonic Hall. The gentleman above in the picture, he looks like he's a dandy, you know, he's all ready to go off and fight. This is Adam Littlejohn, 2nd Michigan Cav, and he's 22 when he enlists. And he actually is here, and he's in Franklin. He occupies the hall, and that very bottom picture is his calligraphy. He drew his name, or excuse me, wrote his name all over the walls. He had no problem with that. But the one thing that we don't have is African-American signatures or markings on the wall. But we just had this feeling that the building had to be occupied by the United States Colored Troops, because so many federal regiments were occupying Franklin between 1863 and 1865. And we knew through some research that the fort was occupied by USET, but we really wanted to know for sure about the hall, and we couldn't find anything locally, anything that might have had any ties to the hall locally during the Civil War. Really was about the Confederacy, not about the federal regiments. So it took me and my director of preservation at the time going to Washington, D.C. and digging through the Court of Claims records for reparations done, you know, damages done to the building during the Civil War, to determine, yes, indeed, looking at the Court of Claims records dated 1905 by those interviewed who were Masons at the time, still living in Franklin, this building was indeed occupied by the USET in 1864 and 1865. And we thought, wow, this is telling. This is, again, a witness site to the realities of the building being constructed by the enslaved, fingerprints still in the bricks today. And then seeing, you know, just seeing it on paper just brought it to life, knowing that these men fought for their freedom, fought for their country, and, you know, they built community even after the war. You know, that's what is so impactful. And to just know that this building had African-American troops in it, we just were like, wow, this is how you tell that full story. It just doesn't end with slavery, and it doesn't end with the, you know, their freedom at the end of the war. It's how they built community after the war. What is that legacy? And in Williamson County, there's been a dearth of that history up until about 3 or 4 years ago, between the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation and then the African American Heritage Society's historian, Tina Jones, really taking the initiative and digging through just hundreds and hundreds of names and you know, muster roll records to find the 330 men, and the number keeps going up. So we know that we have such an opportunity to really make an impact and make a difference for how we tell this story, and using the landscape and the building as the tool to do it. Because I think if we just tell the story where slavery ended in 1865 and, African Americans were freed, then, it just seems so easy to say, oh, see, we're over. No, we're not. They're just beginning, just beginning. I think one would be able to argue very poignantly that Reconstruction, that the fallout of Reconstruction from 1865 to the present day is still going on. We see it between, our 14th and 15th Amendments, voter inequality, the issues surrounding citizenship. Those still matter today. They make an impact in our lives today. And African Americans were finding freedom and building community in Williamson County, even amongst racial inequality, racial violence, because the Klan was very active between 1866 to 1871 in Williamson County, and they never gave up. They were very strategic in how they built community around churches, cemeteries, and schools in Williamson County, particularly in Franklin. And the pictures that you see at the top, that is the taller buildings in the back. That's First Avenue South. All of that area after the Civil War became an expansive industrial area with mills, sawmills, flour mills, cotton mills, and African Americans worked there. And what you see, some of these tinier buildings, these are African American homes. And that first picture on the left, that dates to about 1950. About 1955, though, the mill catches on fire, and the mill is not rebuilt. And so African Americans start moving out of Franklin and moving up into Nashville or other parts of Williamson County. The picture in the center, though, is the back of the Masonic Hall in 1917. It's the earliest known picture that we have of that African American community on 2nd Avenue South. And then the very bottom picture is the African American school on 2nd Avenue South that met in the shorter chapel church that was built in the 1860s following the war. And again, education is so important. That's what they hoped for their children. And to see just see the impact of education within the African American community from 1865 into 1965 in Williamson County, it's understudied, it's underrepresented, but it's so rich. It is content rich for us to be able to share these stories and know how we can tie people and place together to be able to be very authentic and relevant in how we teach history today. And these are some of the things that I've already kind of mentioned, but the hall, of course, was very important because you've got this very large public building during the Civil War. It was heavily used and then becomes very damaged, obviously, because of its use during the war. It was a barracks, it was a quartermaster's office, it was also a hospital throughout 63 to 1865. The picture on the bottom is from about 1920, and those are the Masons of Hiram 7 at the time. Into the 20th century, though, it's a gymnasium for a private prep school. It houses the National Guard Armory during World War I. The American Legion starts there in 1917. It was even a women's suffrage meeting spot, if you can believe that, before 1920 on the first floor. Just a lot of unbelievable things that took place there because, again, it was a community center and it was a very large space. What's really telling, though, is that when the centennial of the Civil War happens in 1964, there is no African American involvement in that. It's very pro-Confederate leaning in how the story was remembered 100 years later. And the Masonic Hall is used kind of as the big meeting spot because, again, it does have about space to hold about 120 people in it on the first floor. But it's how do you tell that story when you're looking at memory and the power of memory in a town that's so ingrained with its Civil War history, the Confederate soldiers that died at the Battle of Franklin. 10,000 men lost their lives. in a matter of 5 hours, killed, captured, wounded, or missing, 2,500 for the Federal Army and 7,500 Confederates. And so when you're looking at that disproportionate amount of men who died, and of course whose side lost the war, that powerful impact of memory comes to play. And Franklin's been grappling with their Confederate past since really 1865. But today this is what 2nd Avenue South looks like. The far upper corner, the brick building you see, that's 1 story. That today is the Pull Tight Players Theater. It sits directly across from the Masonic Hall. But in 1867, this was the first AME church built in Franklin. And then again, the Masonic Hall is the picture that you see. That's how it looks today. The barrier wall is up because of the preservation concerns with the top parapets and the stone pillars. Unfortunately, when the Masons did receive funding from the federal government in 1916 for the damages done to the building during the Civil War, they decided to raise the 3rd floor parapet walls, move the staircase from one side of the building to the other. And when they did that, they changed the roof line. And in doing so, the building's been dealing with a host of environmental and structural issues ever since. So that's really why you see that wooden barricade up front. It's not to keep people out. It's really to hope that if there is ever anything that does fall off the building, it falls behind the barricade walls. But I think it's also important to note that by 1865, this is where African Americans are building their neighborhood along 2nd Avenue South and 1st Avenue South behind the Masonic Hall, where the industry is. That's where the jobs are. This is where they're going to build community with churches, homes, schools. And today in that bottom right corner, there are no more African American homes or churches left. It's now $1 million brownstones that were built about 10, 12 years ago. And the brownstones literally sit on the same block as the Masonic Hall. When you look up in the picture where the hall is sitting today, that is St. Philip's Catholic Church that is now hugging the corners of the Masonic Hall. So there is really no African American presence left on 2nd Avenue or 1st Avenue South, except for the silos that still stand in the bottom corner from Lily Mills when it was a flour mill, and the African American church that now houses the theater. That's literally all that's left. When the industry did pull out, like I said, by the mid-1950s, the African American community moved. And then there's a lot of displacement. The Jim Crow era between the 1920s to the 1960s in Franklin were not quite as idyllic as I think most people would like to believe. There was a lot of racial tension, and the Klan was very active, and people moved. There were about 6 strong African American communities in Franklin up until about the 1960s, and through gentrification and new development, today we only have 2. Hard Bargain, which sits north of downtown Franklin in the historic district, and then the other is the Natchez Historic District, which is still thriving, but it still faces the threat of urban development, because though it's listed as a National Historic District, it does not sit within the local historic district historic preservation overlay. So there are always threats to encroachment, and part of that is because people within the community didn't want government involvement over what they could and couldn't do with their homes within the Natchez district. But unfortunately, because there is no local historic district jurisdiction to stop the quickness of the demolition of some of the historic homes within the Natchez district, we are seeing a shift and turning of that area. And it's and of course, as a preservationist, we always want to see African American neighborhoods thrive, not die down and die off. But what's happening is that with some of these prominent or former prominent African-American neighborhoods and homes being sold, property taxes are going up. And so obviously for people who live in some of these areas, it's very difficult for them to continue to live there because they can't afford to pay the property taxes. So we're working diligently to, promote solution-based approaches to how we can save our African-American communities here in Franklin and Williamson County. And this is what we do on a daily basis, or what I should say I was doing on a daily basis before I left the Masonic Hall Foundation and became the Senior Director of Preservation Education for the Heritage Foundation. We're on ladders, we're peeling paint, we're investigating buildings to understand just the, how was this building put together? Who did it? What were the materials used? And then in doing all of that architectural conservation work, it helps us make a better impact on how we tell the story. But again, these are some of the fragility issues I was mentioning. There's my hand right there in the middle of bricks that are separated, and that's part of the interior wall on the 3rd floor. That's not an exterior wall, that's an interior wall. The far right picture that you see with the parapet, that is leaning about 8 inches out of plume. It's not flush with the roof line. Again, why that barrier wall is up just on the outside chance that something were to fall. The hope would be that it would fall behind that barrier wall. The south wall above my hands, that's moving 3 degrees out of plume. You can even see where a lot of the water damage is. All of this is environmental. But unfortunately, with the Masons being the owners of this building, it means that our job as preservationists or as preservation organizations becomes a little more difficult to save the building, because most donors do not want to give large sums of money to save a site if the nonprofit doesn't own the structure. And that's really where the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation nonprofit came into just kind of a conundrum spot, because without the Masons being able to, or being willing to, I should say, cede ownership, whether it would be 50% ownership or even 100% ownership, it made it very difficult for us to fundraise the necessary funds to do the work to save this building. And so, today, the Heritage Foundation of Williamson County is really advocating for the preservation of this building. We want to see it saved. We would love to see it open to the public. This was our vision about January of 2020, before the pandemic hit, when we thought that we were in a good place to work with the Masons to come up with an MOA and some legal binding agreements to be able to really begin that big fundraising plan to transform the hall, create a visitor center where we could really have interactive, engaging exhibits on, the transcendent history tied to this place, not just locally, but nationally. Highlight the African American and the Native American history here. Highlight, Williamson County as a pioneer county with the Natchez Trace, and bring in the Native American and African American culture here, and really illuminate history that's never been told before, particularly here in Franklin. Franklin is known for its Civil War history. We could talk Civil War history for a long, long time, more than days, years in Franklin. But the Native American and African American history, and land and sale of land, movement of people, why it happened, society and politics and economics, none of that's ever been told. And this is just such an appropriate place to be able to tell it, in the spot where it happened. And we would love to still be able to see that happen. I think the building is definitely savable. It's worth investing the sum of $10 million to restore the building appropriately. You can do it in phases, but even if we did it in phases, it would still come out to be about that same amount of money when you add on a visitor center with, a space for interpretation, and still allow the Masons to meet there, because the Masons are still a part of this story. They are still, they still have their own history tied here. And we wouldn't want to see the Masons not be a part of that story. And we would want the Masons, of course, today it is their building, they own it today. We want the Masons to be a part of that partnership and that collaboration, and working with the community, with our preservation organizations in Williamson County to save the building. Because we believe in the work that we're doing. We believe in community engagement and transparent storytelling, in participatory museums that focus on all people tied to not just Franklin, but the state of Tennessee and the United States. We believe that there is an opportunity to build relationships with the Chickasaw Nation, and to have the Chickasaw Nation involved with the work that we're doing. Because I don't think that it would probably be appropriate to not have the Chickasaw Nation involved in how we transparently tell their story. It's all American history, but it is Chickasaw history. It impacted their nation, their communities, their people, and we would want to have the opportunity to have them involved in that as well. And that's my presentation. So if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. But I thank everybody for listening and watching me talk about something that I've done for the better part of 5 years. And I am excited to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, actually, I had a few questions regarding, you were talking about like this idea of, kind of making this place a transformative educational space.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think one of the issues that I see, with different historical sites kind of come up with was like how to kind of make that almost, I suppose, a happy middle ground,
Yeah.
in terms of, what actually occurred versus what people want to have occurred, and kind of making like that kind of like almost like a happy marriage between the two, where
Mm-hmm.
some people have like a, what they feel like the history has always been for them
Mm-hmm.
based off of their education and their past, and what the facts or what the historical documentation and recent memory actually states,
Mm-hmm.
what this
Mm-hmm.
place was or what these events were. And so like how do we kind of reconcile that, because it's like, well, at the same time you want that same public to benefit from this site,
Right.
or to benefit from these sites, in a
Mm-hmm.
general sense. um like how do you kind of, I guess, balance those without sacrificing historical integrity?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. It's a very delicate balance. Again, because it's collective memory. We're looking at different groups of people who have different perspectives, different memories on what they think a place is about, or what they remember a place being all about, or what their own personal experience has been. With place or with history, with a particular event. And, because we see that with obviously like Confederate monuments, right? We see this is a place, this is our history, don't take it down. But how did that impact others? Other people, other groups of people have different experiences on what they remember or what they experienced, and those voices can't be left out. And I think when we're looking at how we look at uh, worthy public history scholarship interpretation within a museum, it's important to listen to all voices and bring as many groups to the table as possible to have those conversations, and collect oral histories, because I think oral histories help you tell a story in a different way through exhibitry and interpretation. But I think when at the end of the day, it's very important today in the 21st century to be, um, not a purist in the sense that you won't ever bend rules, but that you use the scholarship as the gateway. And when you bring people to the table, you want to be the person that listens. You may be the one in charge of creating the museum or creating the exhibit, or managing the historic site. But at the end of the day, you want to be the one who listens to the groups that you invite to the table and hear their stories first before you start pointing fingers and telling them, no, this is what we're going to do because this is what it says here. It helps create balance and build relationship and trust. And you've got to build trust and build the relationships first when we're looking at how are we going to create a potential museum such as the Franklin History Center at the Masonic Hall. You would want to start talking to people, bringing people to the table, and having those conversations. Ask them, what do you see here? What do you remember? What would you think would make the most impact on how we tell this story? Because, you know, museum professionals can run the risk of thinking that we know it all, we know what to do, right? We've had the training, but I didn't experience this history. I've researched the history, but it's not my own personal familial history. It's American history, but it's not tied to my family. And I would want to know that at the end of the day, my job was to bring people together, to collaborate, to know each other, to build relationships with one another, and to trust each other on how best to tell an authentic history. I learned a long time ago in graduate school that if you begin to make it all about you and what you want, then you should walk away. Because then it's not about the history, it's about self-serving prophecy. And so to me, that's always stuck with me about, it has to be about the resource. It has to be about the stories. Placing that first and foremost, and then building, you know, that coalition of relationships around you to propel the project forward is going to bring the most impact in a positive way.
Right. And, you know, even with like with the educational aspect too, like when we're talking about young people, for instance, you know, not only getting them interested in these kinds of topics, but
Mm-hmm.
also, you know, kind of how do we address some of these? Because I guess one of the things I feel like happens a lot of times with historical education for adolescents and children, like younger children, is like this idea of, you know, we need to make it palatable for you. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
we don't want, you don't need to know every terrible detail about, you know, our history or a history.
Right.
And so we try to soften it for you, but in the process, we also are kind of, you know, negating a lot of things and kind of making like a sanitized version of things
Mm-hmm.
that might misinform over time. And so, you know, so for instance, like um, the fingerprints on in the bricks,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that might be something that's a little intense for people to kind of grasp sometimes. And, you know, you don't know how people might react to it, but, you know, how do you tell like a kid, if you're bringing them to this site to learn, you know, that someone your age did this
Right.
and, you know, and they were property of someone else and forced to do this labor. Like, how do we kind of, I guess, address some of these harder questions for young people in that sense?
Right. Um, when first of all, that's a great question. And second of all, we've never had anyone on our tours, even really young kids, ages 5, 6, 7, um, kind of be taken aback when we tell them about fingerprints in the bricks, for example, because we always took tours outside and started outside so they could actually see it, touch it. The idea was to have a tactile experience, you know, you know, uh, with the story, and to be able to touch the fingerprints, put your fingerprints in those bricks, you know. what size are your fingertips? Do they fit within the bricks, or are they too big? Are they too small? And we always told it with more of an interactive component. It wasn't just regurgitation of facts, it was posing questions. And it was also about choice, you know. And when we would have more kids on the tour, we would say, you know, do you have a choice to sleep in your own bed or not? Do you have a choice whether or not you pick up your own toys or not? You know, who helps you do certain things? And talking about choice really made an impact, because they understood there was a consequence to whether or not they did or didn't do something. And and so then we would say, imagine if you were punished because you didn't pick up your toys, or you didn't, sleep in your own bed, right? What would happen? And they said, well, our parents would probably not be so happy with us, and then we would pose the question, what do you think would happen if a young child who was not given even any choice whether or not to make bricks or not make bricks on any given day, how do you think they would be, their punishment would be? And we had one kid who said, I bet you their punishment would be hard. They probably would get beat. And that kind of stuck with me, because clearly children are listening to things on television. They have access to so much information than ever before now. And I think we don't really give kids the benefit of the doubt with what they know and what they can handle. And I don't ever want to force feed information down someone's throat. I don't want them to feel the same way I do. As a public historian, it's our job to tell the story and pose questions, and then allow those who are on tours or who are reading, exhibit panels, to absorb the information and ask us questions, and have a dialogue, a conversation about it. And I think it's hard to expect everyone to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, even at young ages. I think the most impactful tour I ever took my kids on, for example, was at the Whitney Plantation outside of New Orleans, where it's really the only historic site that's dedicated to telling the history of slavery through the eyes of the enslaved. And it's a powerful tour. And some of their tour guides are descendants of former enslaved, either in St. James Parish or descendants of the enslaved that once were enslaved on that plantation. And my kids at the time were like 15, 17, and they were not as excited about doing another house tour, but I said, this one's going to be different. This one's going to be different. It's not going to be about the Civil War. It's going to be, just trust me. So we get there, we get on the tour, and here is an African-American man, probably late 20s, early 30s, and he was engaging, and he was not holding back on the realities of what took place on the Whitney Plantation. Now, he also posed questions. He wanted people to have a conversation with them on the tour. He didn't just want to keep telling people facts. And that's where I think tours get boring, is when you just have a tour guide saying, well, these dishes date to this point, and, they sat here, and they, this is the study. Like, nobody, I know I get bored on tours like that, and I'm a historian. So to see this particular gentleman just give such an authentic tour, but yet to pose questions of, how do you think the enslaved reacted to this particular situation? How would you view an enslaved woman handling, not having control over her own body, or how she might use her own body to negotiate her own power? That was very eye-opening for me, because I'd never been on any tour where that had ever been said before, and I've gone on a lot of house, museum, Southern plantation tours. But my kids hung on to his every word. Nothing that he said was inappropriate, in my opinion. And because everything was true, everything was factual, real to the plantation and to slavery in Louisiana and slavery across the country at that time. And we left 2 hours later, and my kids were just like, wow, we actually learned something. Thank you for bringing us here. Because what they were able to glean from that 90-minute outdoor tour in South Louisiana in the heat is an experience. To be on a sugarcane plantation in the heat, there are bugs. Was it the same exact conditions of 1840? No, but you're hot. You see the slave cabins, you see the sugarcane rows in the back. You know the realities of alligators and snakes because they told us to stay on the pass because of snakes and to watch out for the alligators in the ponds. You know, don't go feed the gators. So you were immediately immersed into an experience of what daily life would have been like for the enslaved at Whitney. And then to hear the story of those who lived it, suffered death, suffered the realities around being sold, the realities of you are a commodity, you are not a person. It's easy for us to replace you because we just put, you know, a life insurance policy on you. We can recoup our losses. That made an impact for my kids because all of a sudden it was not just about, okay, enslaved people lived on a plantation, they picked cotton, and then that was the end of it. This was a daily life experience, a reality for millions of African Americans who were enslaved on plantations. And I just think that if we're going to provide these types of experiences, that we do our best to immerse our visitors in that experience and really get them up close and personal. Maybe take the ropes down, you know, allow them to touch the walls, allow them to be up close and personal with the artifacts that come out of the ground. And we've done that and we've had tremendous success. And the reason being is because people go, we actually got to touch something. You know, you let us sit on some of the seats. You let us touch, you know, the bricks with the fingerprints in them, because we have many bricks that we have over the past couple of years dug up out of the ground, actually, and you can see their fingerprints in them. We have, you know, hand wrought nails from the attic that date to the 1820s. We have pieces of plaster that, you know, were, you know, that was compiled, you know, by the hands of skilled enslaved craftsmen. Doing that, giving people those types of experiences, break down the barriers and allow you to have those difficult conversations. Instead of just walking into a house where it looks pristine. I'm like, oh, please, house museums would never look that. I mean, a house in 1850 never looked how it looks today. You know, it would have been, there would have been dust, and there would have been the doors open, and it probably wouldn't have smelled really good. You know, if we, the more authentic an experience that's provided by a historic site, the better experience your visitors are going to receive. The more transparent you are with your story. And also, if you do have a difficult story like Whitney, give a disclaimer and at least alert your visitors that it's not going to be an easy tour. It's going to be, there's going to be some difficult subject matter discussed. You know, I think as museum professionals, as public historians, preservationists, we do have an obligation to at least allow a visitor to make their own decision as to whether or not they think their child can handle certain information. What I think my kids can handle versus what someone else might think their children can handle would probably be two totally different things. But you know, providing spaces though to be able to tell the experience of an enslaved child's life through the eyes of a child, I think that's impactful. I know that the Holocaust Museum does that in DC. And that's probably one of the most profound exhibits they have at the Holocaust Museum. And so it's really trying to break down how we would digest this material, for exhibits, and be able to get people uncomfortable, comfortable with the uncomfortable, but not have it be so visceral that they regret going and seeing your site.
Yeah, because it always seems like that's always the issue or the potential trade-off is like, well, some people may want to, say like, well, this has to be talked about and this has
Mm-hmm.
to be talked about in a certain way, so much to the point where, it might turn people off. And it's not
Right.
like you have to cater history to an individual, but I think some people, they just might not be ready to hear certain things, or even if they're ready to hear it,
Oh yeah.
it just like they might need like to be gradually, brought into it as opposed to being dropped off the cliff into like the heavy stuff.
Yeah, the last thing you want to do is have a group of various ages of, you know, uh, well-intentioned visitors and thinking they're just going to come see this old historic building, and then all of a sudden they're plopped into the middle of this very difficult reality of what African Americans and Native Americans went through in 1830 to 1860, and they're like, wait a minute, I didn't pay $20 for this. I thought we were just going to be looking at the architecture, right? But I think again, that's where planning and concise decisions are made prior to ever opening and curating an exhibit, opening the doors as a museum. How are you going to tell your story? And then again, those relationships from within the communities, the Chickasaw Nation and African American Heritage Society partnered with us when we were the Historic Franklin Masonic Hall Foundation, and we worked with them diligently to make sure that we were providing accurate information. How would you want us to, how would you see us telling these stories? And I think that's where the impact is made. I don't want to be the only one making that decision. This should be a collective decision.
And the last question I have for you is, in terms of this site seemed to be like kind of like a multi-purpose space for a community, and like, was that common for a because it seemed like it was a somewhat non-governmental space, but it still had like a political, arm to it. And then it also was not necessarily a religious space, but it had kind of that connotation too. So were there multiple places during that time period throughout the country at the time that had that kind of multi-purpose, you know, I guess, construction to it? And, how many of them are in existence now? And is there a shared even practice or history with that?
Right. Well, as far as Franklin, when they were building the Masonic Hall, they did not have a public space. The courthouse stood in the middle of the public square at the time, and that's just where court businesses were conducted. Most of the churches in Franklin that existed did not have physical buildings at that time. I mentioned the Episcopal Church the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee actually beginning on the first floor of the Masonic Hall. That is because there wasn't an Episcopal church in Tennessee up until 1827 when it first started on the first floor of the hall. So you have the churches forming, but they don't have land to build buildings yet. So it's looking for a space that's non-conforming to one religion or another, or a political place such as a courthouse, to be able to hold religious services, or to have large community gathering spaces. Today we have these large event centers, but there wasn't any kind of event center in Franklin or Williamson County. And so for any kind of community event, if you're going to have a political rally, if you're going to have a church service, or even Jenny Lynn coming in to sing, right? You're looking for a space that has the most space available, and that would have been the first floor of the Masonic Hall. Now things change, obviously, after the Civil War, and you start to see the courthouse used more for political rallies than the Masonic Hall. So the dynamic shifts a little bit, and I'm not sure if that's because how the community shifted in Franklin after the Civil War, where you see, you know, the Masonic Hall kind of being surrounded by the growth of an African-American community, working class community, or if the building is just aging and changing over time, and you know, the Masons are not as open to having people in the building anymore. As far as across the country, though, most Masonic halls were one story, sometimes two, depending upon how many various bodies of the fraternity met there, because there are multiple areas of Masonic fraternity, you know, that that meet in Franklin. So most Masonic halls are just single story, sometimes two. But prior to the Civil War, there were Masonic halls that, at least in Tennessee, that had a first floor meeting space, and then the second floor was reserved for the Masons. Today, you don't normally see what we have in Franklin. Into the early 20th century, they built, the Masons across the country built large, you know, freestanding, more Art Deco style buildings that were, you know, 50,000 square foot spaces that were used for community purposes, but primarily were used for Masonic purposes. So what we have in Franklin is quite unique in the fact that it still stands today.
Well, thank you again for joining us today. We really appreciated your presentation. I mean, the site, it just seems like, you know, what ARC is about, you know, in terms of kind of finding these stories of intersection and these distinctions, but like just this overlap that we all kind of know have happened, you know. It'd be, you know, it just seems like this site in particular kind of embodies a lot of what we're talking about. Like,
Right.
How do we address these multiple perspectives, and how do we kind of reframe the way we've been articulating history and articulating our identities, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I definitely appreciate you wanting to share your work with us and kind of let people know what you guys are doing out there. I think is very interesting.
Yeah, well, we would love to have ARC come and visit Franklin and give you a tour. Obviously, I'm no longer affiliated with the Masonic Hall Foundation, but I can always have access to the building by asking the Masons. I have good relationships with them, and you know, they're still working with us diligently to find a way to preserve the building. You know, and I think that that's going to happen over time. And they want the building open to the public. They actually recognize the history that they have, not just tied to their own fraternity, but tied to the building, tied to the Treaty of Franklin, the enslaved history, the community history, that cultural landscape identity that you just mentioned is so important for us to be able to share that history in Franklin. We have city support to see the building saved. Heritage Foundation of Williamson County wants to see that building saved. So we have multiple avenues to work with, in hoping that the Masons will come alongside and want to work with any of these entities to help them restore that building. And then, you know, hopefully over time, it will become a museum space. COVID really put a damper on a lot of what the planning was all about, as you well know. As y'all have experienced as well. But, you know, Williamson County has tremendous Native American and African American history. It's not just relegated to the hall. The trace originally went through Franklin. The slave coffles walked through Franklin on the old trace. Today you can go out in, you know, 5 miles outside of downtown Franklin and pick up the old trace and drive it, stand on the Highland Rim, look to one side and see, or actually stand and see both sides where on the old trace where the Chickasaws owned land. And again, you're just standing in a place that was once owned by the Chickasaws, and it was their land. And today it's just part of the Natchez Trace Parkway, and there's a trail marker there. But I always get out of my car and I stand on the old trace, and I realized that this is really not ours. This really belonged to the Chickasaw Nation. And how can we be good stewards today in recognizing their past to the land and to history? And so I encourage you all to come up when you can. And my team and I would love to give you a tour of other Native American and African American sites, because there's not just one story. There are many stories within the story to tell.
Thank you so much. And for people who want to help, how would they be able to?
Well, if they're interested in helping, I have my email, rfinch@williamsonheritage.org is the best way to get in contact with me. And then if they're interested in wanting to see the building, I can always put them in contact with the Masons. Or if they are here locally, I'd be more than happy to, work with them, partner with them to, help with the restoration of the building. Or even if they just would ever want a tour, or if they want to see other pictures of the inside of the building, I could always send them pictures too. Happy to do whatever I can do to connect people with the place.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much again for
Stephen.
joining us. And unfortunately, we weren't able to do the symposium like how we were planning on doing it with you present and stuff. But but this was also still very great, and I think it was just really insightful, just the information that you were able to provide for us today. So awesome. Thank you.
Well, maybe next year we'll be in person. I'd be happy to come down to Chickasaw and be a part of the symposium next year. Maybe at that point we'll have Frederick's documentary will be complete or nearing completion, and
I'm looking forward to that.
We can do a panel on that one.
And also, as far as the symposium goes, we still have one more panel going on tomorrow night, tomorrow evening, 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. We are having Coping with Movement, or Coping Through Movement, and we will be joined with Angel Hawk, MSW, as well as Ava Macias and Cedric Turner Copa, discussing how members of African American and Native American communities are coping through life's challenges, whether it's the current pandemic, whether it's just challenges in general, and how do we deal with different life circumstances as they come up, and the different ways that we express through culture and mental health and historical and generational trauma, as well as individual issues. And so I think that one in particular, this panel in particular, I'm of interest simply because it seems, although we have a very much niche, it's a very kind of niche topic. However, it seems like it could span to multiple fronts as well. So yeah, we're looking forward to that one. And awesome. As always, this is how you can reach us in terms of finding that stream. It'll be live on our Facebook page as well as on our website, www.arccenter.org. And all of our social media is Arc Center, @ArcCenter, and facebook.com/ArcCenter as well. So I'd like to thank you all again for watching. And until next time, hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.
Yes.
And thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.